Picture this. It's late afternoon, somewhere in ancient Siberia, around 20,000 years ago, and 8 ancient humans are standing at the edge of a frozen riverbank, staring at something that should, by any reasonable biological assessment, be completely beyond their ability to kill. A fully grown woolly mammoth, a female, stands about 40 meters away, roughly 4 meters tall at the shoulder, weighing somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 tons, equipped with tusks capable of throwing a person 20 feet through the air without particularly trying, and covered in a thick outer coat of guard hair over dense underfur that functions essentially as natural armor against the cold. She's not running. She's not charging. She's just standing there, eating, completely unaware that these 8 small, hairless, relatively fragile bipeds have spent the last 3 days following her tracks, studying her movement patterns, and quietly, methodically working out exactly how this is going to go. What happens in the next 2 hours is neither straightforward nor glamorous. It involves significantly more patience, significantly more coordination, and significantly more genuine physical danger than any documentary has ever really done justice to. It also involves, when it finally works, enough food to sustain this entire group for weeks, enough hide for multiple clothing items and a significant piece of their shelter, enough bone for tools, enough sinew for cordage, and enough fat to fuel their lamps and waterproof their gear through a winter that will get considerably worse before it gets better. This single animal represents an almost incomprehensible windfall in ancient caloric terms, which explains precisely why these 8 people have been willing to spend 3 days in Siberian winter tracking something that could kill any one of them with a casual sideways movement. So here's what this video is actually about, and it's one of the most genuinely fascinating, most practically impressive stories in all of ancient human history. How did ancient humans actually hunt giant animals? Not in some vague, hand-wavy, they used spears and worked together sense, but specifically tactically in practical detail, how did a species with no natural weapons whatsoever manage to consistently, successfully, and deliberately kill animals many times their size across hundreds of thousands of years, eventually doing it so effectively that entire megafauna species went extinct in the process? Stick around because the answer involves genuine tactical sophistication, some remarkably clever environmental engineering, and a level of patient, multi-generational knowledge accumulation that makes modern hunting look almost embarrassingly simple by comparison. Let's start with something genuinely important that needs establishing clearly before anything else makes sense. Ancient humans hunting giant animals were not doing something instinctive. They were not operating on pure reactive aggression or simple opportunistic scavenging dressed up as active hunting. They were doing something cognitively sophisticated, requiring detailed prior knowledge, careful planning, genuine tactical thinking, and coordinated collective execution across multiple people with clearly differentiated roles and responsibilities. Every single element of successful megafauna hunting represented accumulated knowledge, developed and refined across countless generations of trial, error, success, failure, and careful observational learning. Exactly the pattern we've documented throughout this entire series for every other major ancient human technological and behavioral development. Understanding ancient megafauna hunting as a cognitively sophisticated, knowledge-intensive collective enterprise rather than as brute force aggression is genuinely essential because it immediately raises the right questions. Not, how were ancient humans strong enough to kill a mammoth? Because they absolutely weren't. A single human going strength against strength with a woolly mammoth is simply a dead human. But rather, how did ancient humans develop sufficient knowledge, technique, and coordination to convert a genuine physical disadvantage into a consistent hunting success? Because that's what they actually did, and the answer to that version of the question is considerably more interesting and considerably more impressive. Let's talk about knowledge first, because this underpins everything else. Successful hunting of large, dangerous animals requires extraordinary detailed knowledge of those animals, their movement patterns, their behavioral responses to threat, their physiological vulnerabilities, their seasonal habits, their specific territorial ranges, their social structures, and their individual variation in behavior and disposition. None of this knowledge can be gathered in a single hunting season by a single hunter. It accumulates slowly, across many seasons, across multiple generations of hunters pooling and transmitting their observations, building a collective body of species-specific knowledge that no individual could develop independently across a single lifetime. We've discussed extensively throughout this series how ancient human evening fire culture served as the primary venue for exactly this kind of multi-generational knowledge accumulation and transmission. The detailed behavioral knowledge required for successful megafauna hunting was almost certainly one of the most important categories of information circulating in those evening storytelling sessions. Specific observations about how mammoths responded to fire, about which behavioral signals indicated an animal was becoming agitated and therefore more dangerous, about which terrain features and weather conditions created the most favorable hunting opportunities, about which individuals in a locally known herd were most vulnerable or most predictably behaved. This accumulated, transmitted, collectively maintained behavioral knowledge about target species represented a genuinely crucial competitive advantage that no amount of weapon technology improvement could have provided without it. Now let's get into the specific tactical approaches ancient humans developed for killing animals that physically outclassed them in almost every direct confrontation metric, because this is where the story gets genuinely impressive. The most fundamental, most consistently documented approach across multiple ancient hunting sites and multiple megafauna species was terrain exploitation, turning the environment itself into a weapon rather than relying purely on human-delivered force to do the killing work. Cliff drives represent one of the most dramatic and most archaeologically well-documented examples of this. Sites across multiple continents show evidence of ancient humans driving large animals toward cliff edges, using fire, noise, coordinated human movement from multiple directions, and deliberate channeling through terrain features to direct animal movement toward a specific fatal edge. The genius of this approach is immediately obvious once you think through the physics. A cliff does all the killing work, with gravity delivering far more lethal force than any human-thrown weapon could produce, requiring the ancient hunters to contribute only the coordination and knowledge to successfully direct the animal's movement, rather than needing to deliver lethal force themselves. A successful cliff drive required detailed knowledge of the local terrain, specific understanding of the target animal's predictable flight responses, coordinated movement across multiple people positioned to direct rather than purely threaten the animal, and careful management of the entire approach to prevent the animal from detecting and avoiding the trap before it was committed to the fatal trajectory. This is tactically sophisticated in a way that demands real respect, requiring the kind of spatial reasoning, coordinated planning, and behavioral prediction that represents some of the most impressive cognitive capabilities ancient human minds demonstrated across any domain. Let's talk about bog and swamp entrapment, because this represents another genuinely clever environmental exploitation approach with good archaeological documentation. Various megafauna remains, including multiple mammoth specimens from different sites, have been found in bog and wetland contexts in configurations suggesting the animals became mired in soft ground, either naturally or with ancient human encouragement, and were then killed while immobilized or significantly slowed. A 6-ton mammoth that has stepped into genuinely deep bog is no longer a mobile, responsive threat. It's a struggling, increasingly exhausted, increasingly vulnerable target that ancient hunters could approach with considerably less risk than a mobile, alert animal on firm ground. Whether ancient hunters actively drove animals into bog, terrain, or opportunistically exploited animals that had already become mired naturally is genuinely debated in some cases, but the general pattern of wetland contexts concentrating megafauna remains alongside ancient human tool. Evidence is consistent enough across multiple sites to support the conclusion that ancient humans recognized and deliberately exploited the vulnerability that soft, waterlogged terrain created for heavy animals. The same basic principle underlying cliff drives, using terrain to create a situation where the animal's physical advantages are neutralized rather than trying to overcome those advantages directly, applies equally to bog entrapment, reflecting a consistent underlying tactical philosophy that was genuinely sophisticated in its environmental thinking. Let's address fire driving specifically, because this deserves dedicated attention given how broadly applicable it was across different megafauna species and different terrain types. We've discussed fire's role as a tool for environmental management in our survival methods video. But its application specifically to large animal hunting was one of the most significant and most consequential uses ancient humans developed for controlled fire. A coordinated fire drive, setting deliberately controlled burns in specific configurations to channel animal movement in desired directions, required genuine mastery of fire behavior in varying weather and terrain conditions, careful coordination between fire setting and animal directing group members, and detailed knowledge of target animal behavioral responses to fire. Different megafauna species responded differently to fire, and ancient hunters almost certainly developed species-specific knowledge about exactly how each target animal tended to move in response to smoke, flame, and heat from specific directions, knowledge that allowed them to set fires strategically to produce predictable movement rather than chaotic, uncontrolled flight. Fire driving was particularly valuable for species that were otherwise nearly impossible to redirect through human presence alone. Since the psychological impact of fire on most large animals creates significantly stronger and more predictable flight responses than human hunters positioned in the animal's path could typically achieve through pure presence and noise alone. Now let's talk about the spear technology dimension, because while terrain exploitation did an enormous amount of the conceptual heavy lifting in ancient megafauna hunting, the actual delivery of lethal force still required effective weapons. And the weapons ancient hunters developed for large game were genuinely, impressively engineered for exactly this specific purpose. We've covered the general trajectory of ancient projectile weapon development in our guns video, but it's worth examining specifically how those weapons were optimized for large, thick-skinned targets rather than for the smaller, faster prey that dominated most of ancient human daily hunting. Killing a large animal like a mammoth or a giant sloth isn't primarily about wounding it. It's about delivering enough penetrating force to reach and damage vital organs or major blood vessels, something that requires considerably more force and considerably better penetration capability than typical hunting of medium game demands. Ancient hunters developing weapons specifically for large game almost certainly worked through trial and error to identify which target areas on specific megafauna species offered the most accessible pathways to vital structures, which weapon designs provided the best combination of penetration force and accuracy at the distances required, and which approach angles and body positions minimized the risk to the hunters while maximizing the effectiveness of weapon delivery. The Clovis point, one of the most famous and most discussed ancient projectile point designs from the archaeological record, shows design features that researchers have specifically interpreted as optimized for large, thick-hided prey rather than for smaller game, with a specific fluting technique that facilitated hafting to a shaft in ways that improved penetration consistency and force delivery. The sophistication of Clovis and similar large-game optimized point designs represents exactly the kind of multi-generational refinement process we've documented throughout this series. Accumulated improvements gradually optimizing toward more effective performance against specific target types, with each generation inheriting the current best design and potentially refining it further based on their own accumulated hunting experience. Let's talk about persistence hunting here too, because this represents a genuinely fascinating and genuinely ancient hunting approach that's been documented specifically in the context of large game hunting in certain environments, and it deserves real attention rather than being left out because it doesn't fit the more dramatic cliff drive or fire driving narrative. Persistence hunting involves pursuing prey not at sprint speed, but at sustained jogging pace, using human endurance capabilities that genuinely exceed those of most large quadrupeds over extended distances in hot conditions, to run prey animals to a state of heat exhaustion that eventually makes them vulnerable to final close-range killing despite all of their size and speed advantages. Humans are, genuinely and measurably, among the best long-distance running animals on the planet, with a combination of bipedal gait efficiency, sophisticated sweat-based cooling capability, and remarkable cardiovascular endurance that allows sustained effort at jogging pace that most large mammals simply cannot maintain for comparable durations in warm conditions, because quadruped thermoregulation during running is less efficient than human sweat-based cooling, causing large animals to overheat at sustained speeds that humans can maintain almost indefinitely. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Ancient hunters in warm, open environments almost certainly understood and exploited this physiological advantage, using patient, sustained pursuit to bring even genuinely large animals to a manageable state of exhaustion without requiring any direct physical confrontation during the dangerous early phase of the hunt when the animal was still fully functional and capable of delivering lethal defensive force. Now, let's talk about collective role differentiation during an actual hunt, because this connects directly to themes we've explored throughout this entire series regarding ancient cooperative behavior, and it's where the specific social organization of ancient hunting groups becomes most directly relevant to success. A successful large animal hunt almost certainly involved clearly differentiated roles across the group, not a chaotic simultaneous rush, but a coordinated deployment of different people in different positions with different specific responsibilities during the hunt sequence. Drivers positioned to influence animal movement direction through presence, noise, and fire had different positional requirements and different timing demands from weapon throwers positioned to deliver projectiles from the most effective angles at the most favorable moments. Blockers positioned to redirect an animal's flight away from dangerous escape routes had different demands again, and at least some group members were almost certainly designated to observe and provide information about animal behavior that was visible from their specific position but not from other positions, essentially functioning as a coordinated intelligence network across the hunting landscape rather than everyone simply responding to what they could see from their own position alone. This kind of coordinated, role-differentiated collective hunting almost certainly required real communication before and during the hunt, detailed pre-hunt planning in which specific roles were assigned, and specific contingencies were discussed, and real-time coordination capability during the hunt itself through signals, calls, or other communication methods that allowed the group to respond collectively to unexpected animal behavior without the entire plan collapsing the moment something didn't go exactly as anticipated. All of this is cognitively demanding in ways that go considerably beyond simple group presence. And the accumulated experience and trust required to execute this kind of coordinated collective action reliably reflects exactly the kind of deep, ongoing social relationship and collective competence that ancient human groups developed across years and generations of hunting together. Let's address the specific vulnerability targeting knowledge that ancient hunters almost certainly developed for different megafauna species, because this represents one of the most specific and most impressive categories of accumulated ancient hunting knowledge. Different large animals have different physiological vulnerabilities, different hiding depths over vital areas, different behavioral responses to wounding, and different likely trajectories of movement and behavior following initial wounding. Ancient hunters targeting the same species repeatedly across generations would have accumulated detailed species-specific knowledge about where, on that specific animal's body, a well-placed projectile offered the best chance of reaching a vital structure, which approach angles provided the clearest path to those vulnerable areas, and how that specific animal was likely to respond following wounding in ways that affected whether and how the hunter could safely deliver follow-up strikes. This vulnerability knowledge essentially represented an anatomical map of specific target species, developed through thousands of accumulated hunting attempts and hunting observations across many generations, refined by both successful and unsuccessful experiences into genuinely specific practical guidance about where to aim and how to position for the most effective strike. It was almost certainly one of the most carefully maintained and most specifically transmitted categories of hunting knowledge in the entire ancient hunting knowledge base, passed from experienced hunters to developing hunters with exactly the kind of careful, deliberate attention that life or death practical information demanded. Let's bring something genuinely fascinating in here regarding the psychological dimension of megafauna hunting, and what it would have taken, not technically but psychologically, for ancient hunters to deliberately approach animals that could kill them with casual effort. We've discussed throughout this series how genuine physical courage in ancient contexts wasn't some abstract virtue but a practical necessity in many survival situations. But megafauna hunting represents an extreme case that deserves direct attention. An ancient hunter positioned close enough to a mammoth to deliver an effective spear strike was within the animal's defensive range, meaning a single, reactive movement from the mammoth could be instantly fatal. The psychological capacity to hold position, maintain aim, and execute a precise weapon delivery while a 6-ton animal is close enough to kill you requires a genuinely remarkable combination of trained composure, trust in your hunting partners to maintain their assigned positions and roles, and accumulated confidence built through successful prior hunting experiences. This psychological preparation was almost certainly itself part of the transmitted hunting knowledge and culture we've been discussing throughout this video, with experienced hunters actively preparing less experienced hunters psychologically as well as technically for exactly the acute fear management required during the most dangerous phases of large animal hunting. Let's circle back to our opening scenario, those 8 ancient hunters watching their mammoth eat. 3 days into tracking her, holding everything they know about her movement patterns and behavioral responses, working out in collective quiet consultation exactly how the next 2 hours are going to unfold. Based on everything we've actually covered here, what they're doing in that quiet moment before the hunt begins is genuinely impressive on multiple simultaneous levels. They're deploying centuries of accumulated species-specific behavioral knowledge. They're coordinating a tactically sophisticated collective action plan across multiple people with different roles. They're preparing psychologically for a genuinely dangerous physical engagement. And they're doing all of this not for sport, not for status alone, but because this specific animal, successfully killed, represents an almost incomprehensible survival windfall that will directly support their group's well-being through genuinely harsh conditions for weeks to come. So how did ancient humans actually hunt giant animals? Based on detailed terrain exploitation, including cliff drives, bog entrapment, and fire driving, sophisticated weapon technology specifically optimized for large game penetration, persistence hunting, exploiting genuine human endurance advantages over large quadrupeds in warm conditions, coordinated collective hunting with clearly differentiated roles requiring real pre-hunt planning and real-time communication, accumulated multi-generational species. Specific behavioral and anatomical knowledge transmitted through evening fire culture and the psychological preparation and trust required to execute dangerous close-range weapon delivery against animals capable of instantly killing any hunter within their reach. The honest answer is that ancient megafauna hunting was one of the most cognitively sophisticated, most collectively demanding, and most genuinely impressive behavioral achievements in the entire deep ancient human record. These weren't lucky accidents or desperate last resort attacks. They were carefully planned, knowledge-intensive, collectively executed operations that required and expressed some of the most remarkable capabilities ancient human minds and ancient human social organization ever produced. The mammoths and giant sloths and cave bears that eventually disappeared from the ancient world weren't simply unlucky encounters with an accidentally capable predator. They were the victims of a species that had, across hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated learning and refinement, figured out how to systematically, reliably, and lethally overcome every physical advantage those giant animals possessed through pure cognitive and cooperative ingenuity. That's not brute force. That's something considerably more impressive and considerably more worth appreciating than brute force could ever be.